happen to other people, but not to themselves or to their family. And what was striking was that actually signs and symptoms of poor mental health that are often described in the beginning of many mental disorders, such as feeling stressed, withdraw socially, sleeping poorly, being anxious or depressive, that was completely absent from the discussions. And also a view that we have in the Western areas, that mental health or poor mental health is lying on a continuum from good mental health to being very severely ill, and something like that was absent too. It was more for the Indonesian adolescents, at least of this focus groups, it was more something you're either mentally well or mentally ill, but there wasn't any indication of perceiving such a continuum that goes from very well to very ill. And here again, some definitions. In my opinion, mental health is when they cannot do their daily activities normally. I think we would all agree with that. That people with mental disorders, like being alone, are very emotional, that they don't like other people, and especially that they even dislike their own parents, or that they hit other people, which of course can be happening even without a mental illness, or that the behavior is unusual, that they're suddenly crying or suddenly cutting themselves. So very significant deviant behaviors. So what were the differences between appraisals of these Indonesian adolescents? It was a similar studies in Western countries. For example, with Swedish young people would identify mental health as an emotional experience that's part of human condition, something like it's normal to be sad, but this can turn into depression. So they have this continuum perception. Also, adolescents from the UK significantly focused on emotions and on this continuum of difficulties, from minor worries to severe distress. And what also was present in the UK adolescents, and that was quite in contrast to the Indonesian participants, that they felt that you can't see a mental illness from the appearance of a person. So you can't actually see it from how people look like, but that it was more something that is within themselves. But these differences in this conceptualization, of course, suggest that you cannot simply take Western concept and expect people from other cultures, for example, from Indonesia, to just take them in and follow them. So there's much more, I think, with the wealth of research like that into what actually people think is healthy and what is not healthy. I think there is a lot great of need for other cultures to look for themselves. What is it? How the people of their cultures or subcultures, as you said, there are many islands in Indonesia that might have different cultural background, different religions. And of course, if you want to improve their mental health, you have to know what actually means that. If you have the same idea about mental health as they have. So certainly much more research into the concepts across the globe, including, of course, Indonesia and other non-Western countries, are needed to kind of compare that and see where's the overlap between cultures. So like bringing about a core concept, a global core concept of health or ill health around the world. So a bit of the same was found with the determinants of mental health reported by the Indonesian adolescents. And here you can see that they had a good perception that there are a lot of risk and protective factors on very different levels. So that reflects nearly all the levels that I showed you before in the other model. It's the environment, it's school, it's family, it's peers, it's individuals themselves, but more prominent here, and that might be in lieu of the region, is like that spirituality, religion was given a much more prominent role. It is reported to be important for mental well-being also in Western country, but it's less emphasized. And that might have to do with the kind of currency of the study is that social media, that of course plays an increasingly high role with adolescents compared to former decades, that this was mentioned as a huge impact for mental health, where limiting the time with social media was seen as a protective factor. So not spending too much time on your digital devices. So as I said, there were lots of overlap with the Western conceptualizations here, with the key element of bullying as a risk factors, both in school and digital settings mentioned here. A great emphasis given the engagement with parents, and while in Western countries this is more about family separation or split up families. Here in the Indonesian sample, the young people suggested that the quality of communication with parents and a sense of family connection, that these were important factors in mental health. So they added or they put emphasis on additional factors of family quality. The same was with school pressure, that generally in Western countries are just received as pressure to perform. But here in this Indonesian study included also the school environment, what is taught, so the curriculum and the teaching style. So something rarely mentioned in Western countries, probably because we might not have such a great difference in school environments. Of course, there are more older schools and more modern schools, but more or less the school environments are okay. And then, as I said, the importance of religion and spirituality, that is just one of possible protectors mentioned in Western countries, is here regarded as a key determinant of mental health, so given much more emphasis. And so often also poor mental health was conceptualized, for example, as a failure to pray sufficiently often, and in that to connect with God sufficiently. So here, for example, suggestion to improve health would include do more prayers or be more strict in your praying times. Overall, when you look at this particular study conducted in Indonesia, this is quite well comparative with a review that was conducted on mental health literacy in Southeast Asia recently. For those who had participated on Tuesday in our lecture on systematic reviews, if you look at this review, it would certainly not be approved by standard of a systematic review, because it just gave from the flow chart, but it hardly gave data. It didn't give a list of included studies and a quality assessment of the included studies. So it was rather rough. So from the format, it was more looking like a traditional review, even if claiming that it was a systematic review. The brackets here are from me. Here it also showed what you said, that even within Southeast Asia, of course, there are a lot of different cultures. So the country was an important covariate. It was a great difference between people living in the countryside or in cities. It was a great difference between people of higher or lower education, and of course linked to that of higher or lower income. And the religion played a role, although in this review it was not compared. It just said there is a role, but it doesn't say in which direction the role went. It also showed that between the 1970s and almost today, little seemed to have developed. So there wasn't a good indication that there was a general increase of mental health literacy, and it reported that mental disorders were frequently associated also with supernatural and traditional beliefs, and so something that didn't come out that much in the earlier study on Indonesian adolescents. And mainly here again, the main symptoms of mental disorders were seen as a lack of hope or courage, that could be translated to low self-esteem, physical complaints again, then in the article was given as poor mind, then defeat and communication difficulties and abnormal social behaviors. So again, there was little mentioning of particularly frequent symptoms found in the development of mental disorders such as anxieties, worries, or depressiveness or nervousness and tension. So overall, what I think that you can see from that is what I already said in the beginning, that concepts of mental health and mental disorders might not be universal and might greatly differ between cultures. And their cultures, for example, can be described also by different targets such as individualism or collectivism, or femininity and masculinity, despite they might be sharing some key features. So something like that should also be studied. Maybe not only that you study, well, how is it like, for example, in Indonesia, but that you also more broadly study it with features of cultures like this, like the two that I just picked up. So definitely more research is needed also to adapt current diagnostic criteria to culture appraisals, and especially their constituting symptoms. For example, by varying their thresholds, we will see that in the ongoing lectures, and especially programs to increase mental health literacy and early help seeking for mental problems. They need to be adapted to the respective culture. So if you just, for example, take like Western instruments to assess mental health literacy, you might actually get a distorted idea of what people actually think about mental health literacy. So I think in a stepwise approach, like first having this qualitative studies to actually see what topics are brought up by the people, and then include them in more structured instruments. I think that is something that is needed to give a fair assessment of the mental health literacy, and to adapt also programs. And just to give you an idea, because I'm not quite sure whether all of you are, for example, known about these cultural features here for the collectivism, individualism, and femininity, masculinity world map. Here are the definitions. For example, features of individualistic cultures is that everyone has their own opinions rather than it being shaped by the group, that people are more committed to their own interests and their own education, and less committed to kind of family values, like, for example, family honor or family loyalty, so that you can even more easily divide yourself from your family. That you have the idea that education is a lifelong progress and not just for young people, that people are expected to care for themselves and their immediate family rather than for their extended family, like you, for example, often see in Africa, which is often seen as a problem there in kind of progressing, that people have a high self-awareness and are independent rather than identifying and defining themselves by their groups and their group ties, that you make friendships on an individual selective base rather than by your group membership. And that is the same with making decisions. And for example, in the literature, of course, these individualistic cultures are generally regarded as Western cultures, whereas in the literature, Indonesia is more regarded as a country with more a collectivistic culture, but changing and marching towards more and more individualistic features, especially in the people with a higher education. And on the other hand, here was masculinity versus femininity, where Indonesia wouldn't be considered to differ too much from Western countries, or in the range of Western countries, so somewhere in between both, where masculinity would be defined by countries where the man's role is to rule and woman's role is to raise up the children, while in the femininity culture, man would be involved in children's upbringing, even to the degree of changing nappies and getting up in the night. In a masculine culture, gender roles would be very explicit and concrete, while being more interchangeable. In a femininity culture, then of course men are more highly valued and dominate the society. So genders are not that much treated equally. And in a masculinity culture, independence is important, and success plays a great role, and ambition leads access, and the great and fast are considered beautiful, and you live to work well. In the femininity culture, the mutual dependence is an ideal where a diversity is appreciated, where you serve your country, and where you also value those who are not so gifted, and where work is mainly for a living, but not the living aim. So these are things, for example, that could be assessed, of people's opinions according to that could be assessed together with mental health opinions or health opinions in order to map more individually what shapes concepts of mental health or mental ill health in a certain direction. So, are there questions, comments so far? Because that would have been like the first section of today's lecture.
Okay, so we going to begin the discussion, Frauke?
Yes, I think it's a good point to start that.
Okay. If there are any question for the participant, you can write your question in the chat or raise hand to ask the question.
May I ask the question directly?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. My name is Ernestine. I am a master student in clinical psychology. Thank you for your explanation, Frauke. So my question will be related with your slide about the importance of engagement with parents, and also with the society, individualism versus collectivism. So let me explain first that I am a volunteer for peer counseling, and I have been receiving stories from a lot of youngsters like 16 years old until 20 years old during this pandemic that their parents are limiting their access for the mental health. So you said that this is the importance of engagement with the parents, right, for their mental health and so on. So it's harder for the Indonesians to reach out for mental health services because they are struggling with their parents. Their parents tends to like dismiss their needs for mental or psychological help because they think, the parents think that you can just pray these things away. You just need to be more grateful. You just need to be engage more, speak more, think more positively, just like what explains in this study. So I think the millennials, like their peer groups, are aware about this condition that they should be asking for help, but their parents, because they think that it's going to be temporary. You just need to pray. You just need to be more grateful and so on.
Mhm.
So my question will be like, how to educate the parents about this, because these children, these young people, they are like kind of like powerless when they have to talk about their parents, about their mental health. So what can they do to explain about this to their parents? That will be my question. Thank you so much.
I think especially in a culture where religion is important to generally improve mental health, you have to bring in the religious leaders, like the imam, and maybe one thing, if the imam is open to the concept of mental ill health, that praying at a certain point is not sufficient, then he could talk to the parents, and because then it would bridge the parents' concept of religion or God heals all, and you just have to obey him, and then everything will come well. And they might need respective religious figure to tell them, no, sometimes it's different, that isn't enough, and then God wants you to solve the problem in an appropriate way. We had that in the Western countries, in particular was a Catholic church who was in the past very, very reluctant about mental health and psychiatry, and actually nowadays in their curriculum to become priests, they learn about mental health as well, so that they can recognize where they can help someone with problems. And of course, with certain problems, spiritual guidance is very, very helpful. But with a clear mental illness, it might have their limits. And so it has begun that people who will play a role in spiritual guidance are now learning in their curricula where these limits are. And maybe that is something that might be in a dialogue with your religious leaders, something that will help in the future. But for now, maybe you can bring in a spiritual leader, an imam, or someone who could also talk to the parents, who is open to the idea that these young people need additional help other than just increase their prayers, and who could tell that also the parents. Maybe it's a kind of collaborative work towards adolescents' well-being could be an approach, if that is possible.
Okay, thank you, Frauke, for your answer.
There's no other question, Frauke, for now.
Okay.
We have 9 minutes before breaks. What do you
So I
think?
think we have the break now and then start
Okay.
with the new section.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, we will break for 30 minutes until 15:20, maybe 20,
20, yeah, yeah.
20, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
So 20 past.
Yeah,
Because with me
20.
it's 10:20 then. Okay.
Okay, Prof.
Ach Mensch, Maus, ich habe es gerade sauber gemacht. Ja.
We can start, Frauke, or we will wait for 2 minutes?
We can start. Yes.
Okay. Okay, we can start the next topic on psychopathology.
Yeah.
The lecture will last until 5 o'clock, Frauke, before we start the discussion session, but you can freely to manage your time. Maybe you want to cut in the middle of the lecture and then we go to discussion, or we can continue with your...
Yeah, I think we can also, I mean, if we see that there is questions or comments,
Yeah.
Then we can kind of cover them at any time.
Okay.
Okay, so welcome back all. So now we come to the main part of this lecture, and that is the role of psychopathology and the need in the end for more psychopathological research. Psychopathology comes from the Greek term for soul, spirit, suffering, and reason, and actually means the teaching of the sufferings of the soul. And it was coined already in the late 19th century by a German psychiatrist who wrote a chapter about Allgemeine Psychopathologie. So this means general psychopathology, but actually as a scientific discipline, something that you can really not only describe but study. It is commonly agreed that the scientific field of psychopathology has only started a couple of decades later in 1913 with Karl Jasper's book that also called Allgemeine Psychopathologie, General Psychopathology. And it was actually with this book of Jasper's that psychopathology had become a core science of psychiatry and of course also of clinical psychology. So when I speak here of psychiatry, I also mean clinical psychology. And it, in a way, psychopathology has always provided the Gestalt for mental disorders. A Gestalt is a German term that comes from the philosophy and means something like the overall concept, the way things appear, and not only from the outside, but in their general and whole meaning. However, although psychopathology in the beginning was like the core science, if you wanted to do work with people with mental illness, or if you wanted to work in that field, you had to be an expert in psychopathology. And most of the discussions, most of the science was around how to capture symptoms, how to group symptoms, and how to describe symptoms, and actually how to define what was a symptom. So a lot of the former emphasis was on actually trying to define a distinction between mental health and mental ill health, and like the gray zone between it. However, the objectives of psychopathology, how to deal with psychopathology, that despite its central role, has always also been a topic of discussion, with no clear objectives or no clear grouping as what type of psychopathology there is. And so in 2010, the Task Force on Nosology and Psychopathology of the World Federation of Societies of Biological Psychiatry, interestingly of biological psychiatry, had made an approach to review theory, tasks, and tools of psychopathology and identified 3 main interrelated objectives that likely will also play a role in the future or currently. And that is the descriptive or general psychopathology, the clinical or nosological psychopathology, and the theoretical or etiological psychopathology. And we will have a greater look into these different fields of psychopathology now. As for the descriptive or general psychopathology, that has 2 main tasks. The first one, and that was often regarded as a main one, was to describe and denominate persons' subjective experiences and behaviors in a way that allows objective communication about. So this is, in fact, to provide a unitary nomenclature. So where, for example, one would define social withdrawal in a certain way, or depression in a certain way, or delusions in a specific way, and where you would only use this particular word for this a very defined and detailed experience of a person. So this is actually giving unitary names to well-defined symptoms. So this is one of the main tasks of the descriptive psychopathology. And then, of course, to give name to a symptom, you have to define what is a symptom. So the second task that is greatly interrelated with the first is to distinguish abnormal from normal experiences and behaviors. And in this case, there are also kind of 2 subspecialties. And one is the spatial psychopathology that focuses on patient self-experiences and reports. So actually on symptoms that are described and experienced by the patient themselves. So this is a focus on a first person description. And then there is functional psychopathology that defines deviant mental functions by clinicians' observations or third person's observations, or by deviant test performances. So here it's not the person itself who reports a certain likely abnormal experience, but it's more abnormal behavior that is observed by others. And let's have a deeper look into that. As regards the first task, to give a clear nomenclature of symptoms, this has actually not come true so far. There are still a lot of terms around phenomena that are used interchangeably. For example, with my specialty, with the early detection of psychosis, there is actually a kind of Babylonian speech confusion around that, to the degree that I once was so angered that I wrote an editorial about it, where attenuated psychotic symptoms that are commonly described by clinician assessments with special scales as subthreshold psychotic experiences are confused with the so-called psychotic-like experience that are generally only assessed by fully structured interviews of laypersons or by questionnaires, frequently in the general population. So they are not seen through the lenses of an experienced clinician, and thereby commonly don't correlate with clinician-assessed attenuated psychotic symptoms. So they're not, cannot be used interchangeably. Or then people speak then of low-grade psychotic symptoms or of psychotic experiences, likewise often with meaning interchangeably self-reported questionnaire-assessed symptoms or clinician-assessed symptoms to various degrees. So this is one of the examples where different phenomena are used interchangeably, and then of course research results are compared or even, for example, mixed in reviews or systematic reviews and meta-analysis, if it comes to the worst, where that are actually non-comparable. So where actually apples and oranges are mixed. On the other hand, sometimes the same phenomena are given different terms. And of course, that also hinders a good perception of the actual evidence for something, because then you might treat the same thing differently and don't get a full picture of the full evidence. And again, there is one example from my field of research where, for example, the basic symptoms that we assess as part of the clinical high-risk criteria are used in a different scale and then be named as self-disorders or self-disturbances or anomalous self-experiences, subjective experiences, or anomalous world experiences. And so you have this whole bunch of things that are actually describing the very similar or the same phenomena, but are treated as if it was differently. So actually in view of that, when I read a paper, the first thing I do in my field of research is I look how things were assessed in order to kind of place them in my mind in the right category. For example, whether it's clinician assessed or self-reports with questionnaires, or whether actually a scale was used that uses the same definitions for symptoms, so that I don't confuse like things that are different and don't belong, or that I don't confuse perceiving things as different that are actually the same. And of course, this is just one example from my point of view. My colleagues that with different mental disorders as specialties really kind of complain about the same things. And so this is one of the reasons why often nowadays psychopathology is regarded as a weak science, as something that is not objective. And of course, part of this view is simply related to its current failure to provide a clear, unambiguous nomenclature. And thereby, of course, it decreases validity, it impedes progress in kind of syndrome formation or in etiological research. And it, as I said, it can convey a very distorted picture of the level of evidence. So what I can just advise you, if you have a specialty, or if you look at evidence, also always look how it was assessed, and need be, if you're unclear how it was assessed, look in the assessment to get your own perception and a good perception of what was actually assessed. For example, I once, that was actually a shocking moment for me, in a conference where there were results presented on this experiencing sampling method that was quite new then, and they reported that differing with stress levels, people would be more or less delusive. And I wondered how they assessed that, and because in experience sampling, of course, it really relies on what you ask at this moment when your device is beeping. And then they said, well, yeah, our question was something along the line, yeah, do you feel nervous at the moment and tense? And then I asked again, because I thought I had mislistening. And then they said it again, and I said, well, but this isn't delusion. This is tension and nervousness. This is completely different from being delusive. And they just stood there and said, well, but we call it delusion. Yeah. And of course, something like that, if you then read reports where, of course, they don't report what the specific questions are. And then you read the reports that delusion in the general population is normal and varies with the level of stress. Yeah, so, and of course, then it gives you a distorted picture of the level of evidence, because what they actually assessed was tension and nervousness and the feeling of being stressed and not delusion. So this is why nomenclature is really, really important, and I personally have come a little bit obsessed about it, as my students can tell you when they write something. That I'm very specific with terms, just to try to get a specificity into the nomenclature, at least in my writings. For that, I'm mainly responsibility, that you really know what you're dealing with. As regards the subterms of the second task, to divide abnormal from normal, for that, in special psychopathology, empathy has been the main clinical tool. The clinicians sat down there and listened to patients with great detail, with lots of time on their hand, to try to understand and really apprehend what was going on in their minds. Of course, you can also systematically explore the self-experience best by semi-structured clinical interviews. The semi-structured is important because otherwise, if you just read a list of symptoms, you don't get into the dialogue with the patient, where you might also come across things that you haven't asked for, because hardly any semi-structured clinical interview is really fully getting the whole picture of all possible symptoms. So actually, special psychopathology with this empathetic approach was used to kind of get this Gestalt, the full picture, a good understanding of the patient's mind as a foundation for a valid clinical and diagnostic appraisal. And I think that is still what people are expecting if they seek help from a psychologist or a psychiatrist, that foremost you talk to them and try to understand what is their problem. However, in medical training and psychiatric training, but unfortunately also, at least in Europe, in the training of clinical psychopathologists, really the careful assessment of special psychopathology is not well trained yet. So people are often unclear about the definitions of symptoms. They are unclear how to ask for it. They fail to detect them and further following them up in patients' reports. And thus, slowly but surely, thereby the variance of the normal and the abnormal and the border between it starts to blur. So something that was much more clear in the past with the old psychopathologists, it starts to blur. And the more it starts to blur because of lack of training, the more it is held against psychopathology as a weak skill, as something that is not so important, or gives ways to arguments that you need to look for more objective methods to define mental illness and to diagnose mental illness. And this is actually kind of creating a vicious circles where the decrease in knowledge of special psychopathology and the loss of skills increases the perception of special psychopathology as invalid and unreliable, and gives more focus on perceived more objective measures and less emphasis on teaching. Then, of course, this decreases the knowledge even more, and you're in this vicious circle. And all of that is further nourished by the focus on inter-rater reliability rather than validity in current diagnostic systems, in particular in the DSM of the American Psychiatric Association. So this ongoing erosion in the core skill actually of psychiatry and clinical psychopathology is further nourished by clinical casualness, then of course economical pressure of healthcare systems. For a good special psychopathology, you need time with the patient, and also current research systems and endeavors such as the RDoc project are further eroding special psychopathology, because they look for ways to base mental disorders on dimension of observable behavior and neurobiological measures. So particularly do not rule in special psychopathology, and or other things like the High Top initiative, they only focus on a fraction of possible symptoms, and thereby leading to an impoverishment of special psychopathology. And we often find that in our special ambulance, where we see people with possibly beginning psychotic disorders, who are often referred to us because their treating clinician finds them quite weird, quite odd, and often they report symptoms just associated with other disorders, but not listed as the main symptoms. And then they're confused because they haven't learned about anything more than just the list of symptoms included, for example, in DSM or ICD-10. So with that, and especially with endeavors such as the RDoc, the functional psychopathology nowadays is by many considered much more important and is much more focused. As I said, that would not include really the person's self experiences, but rather the impressions of the clinician or other persons, or just test performances, for example, like neuropsychological tasks that are presumably regarded as more objective, even though all of us know that even neuropsychological performance can be depending on many other factors, just like the patient's motivation, the attention, or the surrounding in which it takes place, the level of sleep in the night before. So it still is biased by several things, and also like supposed standard measures that gives you norms and deviances from the norms might go wrong even at places where you wouldn't consider it. An example of that is from one of our studies on children and adolescents, where we used a large test battery, and that was in Switzerland, and we used neuropsychological tests that generally had been standardized in Germany. So the general perception is that these norms should be applicable also to German-speaking Swiss adolescents. And then we came across a very funny results, because suddenly the verbal fluency of adolescents of the general population was nearly as poor as those of the clinical samples, with more than a third being one standard deviation below the norm. And that, of course, is with the other things being quite okay, was a very, very funny finding, a very puzzling finding. And then we found that a possible reason, and that was we performed a study in the canton of Bern, and the Bernese dialect is a very, very slow one. People speak very slowly. And for example, even within the inter-country comparison with the canton of Zurich, that was a finding from a study conducted by language researchers. They found that the Bernese persons would speak 4 to 5 sentences less than a Zurich person in 1 minute. And of course, then, if you have a test where you are asked to give a lot of as much words with a certain characteristic within 1 minute, if you speak slower, you will quite more easily fall below the norm than as if your normal way of speech speed is higher. So likely there, for example, the norms that are supposedly objective, and in this case were supposedly transferable, did give a distorted picture. So this is just one example how these supposedly more objective neuropsychological performances can quickly lead you the wrong way. However, for example, in the DSM, these are giving preferences, for example, in the dimensions put forward to rate in case of psychosis. And you can see that here, the dimension of cognitive disturbances is here solely expressed by neuropsychological tests without any consideration, for example, whether or not that has to do with psychosis or not. For example, someone with a mental retardation, of course, will likely present a severe reduction in cognitive functioning, but that might not be related to anything like psychosis. That's a little bit different in the ICD-10, that generally is giving still more focus on validity and not only on reliability. And here the descriptions for cognitive symptoms are more along what you might see in a clinical interview. So difficulties in cognition as obvious during the interview, like concentration drifts, slight disorientation, or when it's more difficulty, more severe attention deficits during the interview, difficulties to plan, or with a grossly disturbed orientation. So these might be things that you might see in the interview. However, still, when available, they also recommend that this domain should be based on results of locally validated and standardized neuropsychological assessments. So here you see how functional psychopathology comes in more and more. So in a recent paper by Pavlova and Uha, they actually ask whether it is still feasible to ask, to put questions or to question patients in psychiatric interviews. And they criticized the special psychopathology, especially for likely response biases and for their accuracy. And they put forward future methods to assess a diagnosis like this ecological momentary assessment to minimize memory bias. But as we saw in my earlier example, if you put the wrong questions there, so if you're not knowledgeable enough with special psychopathology, you might come out with a very distorted picture of what happens to the patient, even if you have no memory bias in there. Or that they use like speech analysis. For example, that was reported to detect depression quite well, or pupillary reactivity to certain stimuli, or to check activity and sleep levels via actography, or to use virtual reality to assess behavior in different standardized surroundings. I think all these methods are quite interesting, especially for research, or that they might add to diagnosis, like brain imaging or other tests. But if I imagine my patients, if you would simply just put them through a line of such methods without actually talking to them, I think in the end they wouldn't follow your advice, because they wouldn't believe in your advice, because they wouldn't believe that you understand what is happening to them and what their problem is. And that is one of the bases, I think, for compliance and for a good client-doctor or client-psychologist relationship, that the patient believes that you have a good understanding of what is going on in their lives, in their mind. I don't think that you can reach that when you rely on functional psychology alone. They further put forward that new method should be further approved by analysis based on artificial intelligence, and that quite explicitly to rule out the main source of error, and that is the human. But as Nancy Andreasen has already complained, like first complained like 20 years ago, or more than 20 years ago, if you want to take out the human from psychiatry and psychology, yeah, then you will really dehumanize it, and you won't do any good to your patients that rely often because on social relationship with you, because frequently they're missing social relationships, for example. You can't take out the human from a human problem. Are there questions, comments to this so far?
I think still no question, Frauke.
Okay.
Frauke, can I ask a question?
Random, Frauke.
Yes. Thank you very much, Frauke. Hello. How are you? You look so fresh today. Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Yep. Yes, I'm wondering with the spatial psychopathology that you have just explained. It's quite, maybe not really new, but in terms of the terminology, distinguish the differentiation between spatial and functional psychology is, I think for me, it's quite new. Even though in the methods that you explain, this is what is actually spatial and what is actually functional psychology. Can you, or maybe it is because we are here more exposed by psychology from American point of view, where this one maybe more European or this style or European based, yeah. But it's quite interesting for me. Can you explain a little bit more about the spatial psychology, whether it is actually be applied right now in the clinical practice more than in the academic exposure at our academic atmosphere? Because it seems like we as a clinician here, maybe if we do like counseling or therapy with our clients, our approach is more likely to the spatial psychology, psychopathology, even though it's not so detailed as you explain here. Yeah, can you?
Yeah, I think in your clinical work, what you mainly rely on still is spatial psychology. Yeah, you talk to the patients and you make and you relate their descriptions to certain symptoms. Yeah, for example, if they say they have heard a voice but no one was there, you think, okay, that's a verbal hallucination. Yeah, so this is what you do. This is what spatial psychology is doing. Yeah, but still it needs research. Yeah, so you have to research spatial psychology. For example, the thresholds between normal and abnormal might be different in certain cultures. You still need a more detailed descriptions and links and thresholds for symptoms, so that you get a more universal and generalizable nomenclature. Yeah, so for example, when is depressiveness actually pathological? That might vary through different cultures. Yeah, for example, if you look at the DSM, that says, well, that if you have lost someone, yeah, there is a certain period where you can feel very distressed, but this should differ from normal depression in certain characteristics. Then this might not hold true for all cultures. Yeah, so I think even for a culturally just psychopathology, you can't just take what is written or what is described from a certain point of view, but you still need research on it, because the research that was done in the past, even in Western cultures, where our culture was different. Yeah, 100 years ago, the culture was not the same as it is now, even here. So you might update and validate and culturally adapt this psychopathology. And I think this is something that is not done. Rather, people look for things that take out the patient in a way, or that take out the patient's descriptions. They look for blood levels, imaging studies, or for these functional psychopathology studies to diagnose patients. But patients come for their mind, for their souls, and not for their and not only for their, let's say, brain activities. Yeah, and this was, and I think this oftentimes psychopathology is just taken like one objective, but it's different. Certainly has different objectives, and that were grouped by this task force into certain, although of course the interdependent and overlapping fields. And this is why there is this terms like the special or functional psychopathology and this different fields. So also to pinpoint that psychopathology is about very many different tasks actually, but each of those tasks is important. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and maybe that's related to the one that you said, it's like a vicious cycle where we may build up our knowledge based on the research that have been done, and then the research are more likely focusing from broad standard that we use. Yeah, and then we like not connect to the culture of the person and the sort of things. Yeah, because for example, we use maybe DSM or even ICD, maybe also some of criteria quite close to DSM as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and then how to make us come back to the spatial psychopathology things.
I think in a way it's really using the old skills that you kind of make qualitative research, for example, to see what this result is, or to start with general subjects of mental health, to go into your culture and see what is actually perceived as ill. Yeah, so not to put the label of ill on something that is normal in the population, but not in the Western population.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so to adjust that, and as I said, even for Western cultures, generally the description of symptoms has never been updated.
Okay.
Yeah, they have updates of syndromes, but this is the topic of the clinical or nosological psychopathology that we come to next. Yeah, that is what they have updated, but then but never really. So there are very, very few groups that look into symptoms and look deeply into symptoms, even beyond those in DSM.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for example, also the group of Joseph Parnas in Copenhagen. They are doing like really psychopathological research also. Yeah, but very few do that. They use psychopathology, but they don't critically and scientifically use it, but they use it in clinical practice, and then are surprised when they don't pay sufficient attention that it doesn't work.
Yeah, because it's less dominated. Or it's dominated by the dominance or mainstream. Yeah. Okay, our homework. Thank you, Frauke.
Other questions?
Okay.
May I have a questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, my name is Wahyu. I'm from undergraduate student. In this occasion, I will ask something about the correlations between the term psychopathology and the mental health, Prof. Frauke. I mean that if we can, am I right if we can say that a person who has a psychopathological characteristic or something like that is as means as he or she also has a poor mental health?
At least
or,
not a fully well mental health.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, depending on the degree of psychopathology, but psychopath, if you have a psychopathological symptom, you have something that it interferes with your mental health. Yeah, so if you can say that if you have symptoms defined as psychopathological, you're not fully mentally healthy, but you can't turn it the other way around. You can't say you're fully mentally healthy because you don't have a psychopathological symptom, because mental health is more than just not having symptoms. So you can just make a conclusion from psychopathology to poor mental health, but not from the absence of psychopathology to good mental health. Does that answer your question about the relationship?
Okay, thank you for the answer. And maybe one question, how about the first term? Maybe if when a people has a poor mental health, maybe it's like emotional disturbance when the people feeling so bad of the day, and it will change to maybe a depressive or something like that. How about that? It is also, we can say that a poor mental health also actually can be a sign of a psychopathology, or yes.
Generally, if you have a poor mental health, you are more likely to find also signs of mental illness, that you might not be mentally ill, because for that because it's on a continuum, or thought to be on a continuum. So there's a certain range where it's still normal, and only at a certain point it becomes unnormal. So psychopathologic. Yeah. For example, feeling sad because something happened might, at this very time, might feel you not mentally 100% well, but still it might be a normal reaction. So your sadness is not a psychopathological sign, at least not as long as it is not excessive, culturally unaccepted for the reason of why you're being sad, and it's not exceeding certain time frames that might also differ from culture to culture. Yeah, so it's a very complex decision of whether or not a certain emotion on a continuum is still within the normal range, or whether it should be regarded as something pathological. Does that make it clearer?
course. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Frauke, Prof. Frauke, for your answer.
Okay, Frauke, it's interesting discussion. So we need to start considering culture when understanding psychopathology, yeah, and make sure the threshold for abnormal terminology. That's right, Frauke? Okay.
Yeah.
So when we assess psychopathology or abnormality, so it must be contextual. Is it true? Is it right?
Yes. Yeah.
So because I start to questioning about some assessment that not assess the context about the disorder or psychopathology, like general symptom, like you said before, the question about do you sad, do you angry, do you feel what stress, maybe, because it's not contextual. That's right. Yeah. Okay.
And so it might be even if someone feels severely anxious or so severely depressed, it might be of a course. For example, if you're in a life-threatening situations, of course, being panicking or whatever is normal. Yeah, but this might also occur within, let's say, a psychotic patient. When a psychotic patient feels, because of his psychosis, that his life is threatened, and is panicking, then the panic is a normal reaction. And it's not an additional abnormal reaction, because his situation he's in, for him, justifies getting into panic. And oftentimes this is if you just list symptoms, and just look, is there someone with great anxieties or was feeling panic? If you didn't just tick, up from the outside perspective, there was no reason for panic because he wasn't really threatened. And then you say, and he was having a panic attack, when actually for the person there was a good reason to panic. And things like that. That's a very simple example, but contexts like that have to be considered, and not every possibly abnormal reaction of a patient is always abnormal just because it's a patient. It might be a normal situation in the context of the patient. And so distinguish that, and not to apply more symptoms to a patient than he or she is actually having. That is also something that is guided by, would be a task to teach in special psychopathology. And something like that, to really discuss that on single patients. So the so-called bedside teaching, that is often not very well taught anymore.
Okay. So therefore, reliable assessment is still interview, right, Prof? Then
yes, I think the best is really to get a good knowledge about possible symptoms, and then to talk to the patient to see that you cover with your question all possible symptoms, but also that you are aware whether something within the description of the patient needs to be acknowledged more and to interviewed in more depth, so to really get a good picture. And at least our patients, they're very, very grateful if you spend time with them, and if you try to understand their problem and the context. and they're very unsatisfied with just like a 20-minute interview and then you get your diagnosis because they don't think you have understood it. And I couldn't imagine that's the same in Indonesia, because I think spending time with the patient is particularly important when they might be more reluctant to come.
Yeah, yes. Especially in Indonesia, people have social disability very high. Yeah, I think this interview is one solution to explore or assess the abnormality.
Yeah.
Is there any question, participant? You can raise your hand or write it at the chat. Maybe Ernestine, you want to ask another question?
Hi, Frauke, it's me again. So I'm just a bit of confused, but yeah, just like Bu Endang said that maybe this discourse about functional psychopathology and what is it, spatial psychopathology is not, it's quite unusual for us Indonesian. So is there like a situation like spatial psychopathology versus functional psychopathology there in your place? So like there are more sides who are thinking that spatial psychopathology is better, or functional psychopathology is better, or how is the condition there in your place? I just need to clear things up. Thank you.
I think, for example, where functional psychopathology really has a course is when you look for intellectual disability. Yeah, because that by definition our IQ is an IQ below the norm. Yeah, so there isn't much of special psychopathology to come in, because that needs to be tested by definition, and it has never been differently. Of course, if you have a poor result, but someone is performing very well in high school, then something like a clinical apprehension comes in, and you say, well, possibly I have to retest because that result might not be valid. And but if you think of most other constructs, they are more or less purely based nowadays, despite all the neglectance and despite all the search for alternative criteria. Our clinical criteria are still based on special psychopathology. And that is why it makes even less sense that it is often nowadays so neglected in specialty trainings, because it's special psychopathology still guides all clinical reasoning. And if people are not well trained there, then there are wrong diagnoses, and then there are wrong treatments. And this is more and more, in fact, this is more and more the case, what you see in the clinic. You more and more see poor assessments, poor diagnosis, insufficient, inadequate, not working interventions. And that is because of the neglect of psychopathology. And that is what is held against special psychopathology. That they say, well, because, sorry, I accidentally hit the button, that they think just because it doesn't work is because special psychopathology is unreliable. But it's not that it's unreliable. It can be a very, very good instrument to use, but it's poorly taught. And like if you have a surgeon that is poorly trained, you can give him the best instruments, like a laser scalpel or something like that. Yeah, he will cut in the wrong ways, yeah, because of its training and not because the instrument you give him is faulty. And that's like the case with special psychopathology nowadays. And maybe in terms of times, if there are no pressing questions, we continue with the lecture. As I said, I had hoped that we have a lot of discussion, and we have.
Okay, cool. It's very interesting.
I also feel some need to kind of give you the whole lecture and not just half of it. Is that okay?
You can continue.
Okay. So we have kind of tipped into the topic of clinical or nosological psychopathology already. That is actually based on the descriptive psychopathology, be it spatial psychopathology or functional psychopathology. And it actually, from the level of symptoms that are defined by descriptive psychopathology and given name by descriptive psychopathology, clinical or nosological psychopathology takes these symptoms and groups them together into what we then know as a diagnosis or a mental disorder. And nowadays, we do that increasingly with help of some kind of statistical modeling. And for example, before I said that, especially for functional psychopathology, artificial intelligence-based methods are very recommended. But in a recent a paper from a group I'm working with, we compared clinical models with imaging models, with genetic models, and there we found that using the same well-established analytic measure, and that was a KI-based algorithm, in fact, the clinical model performed best. So if you use good, or if you have well-defined symptoms, and I hope in this group symptoms were quite well defined because I supervised the assessments, that then if you have this well-defined symptoms, they outperform like biological measures, and by far. They can complement each other, but they outperform. And so in the past, and even still now, once we have identified symptoms, we base our diagnosis on these symptoms. And with very few exceptions, still our diagnosis for mental illness are based on symptoms identified in special psychopathology. And that then, of course, lays also grounds for the studies of the causes of mental disorders, because generally, when we look at etiological models, there are etiological models for a certain mental disorder rather than for a certain type of symptom, which might be debatable as well, if this of full mental disorders a good target, or whether or not they are too heterogeneous at the end of the day, and whether or not we might be better off in studying smaller syndromes or even causes of single symptoms. One example where this was successfully done was with verbal hallucinations that have been studied in functional brain imaging, identifying that, in fact, there is an activity in the areas that are normally used for processing real verbal stimuli that are activated in the same way as if someone is talking, and that actually gives them the impression that there are voices, even if there are none. So this is just one of the very few examples where there was actually and quite successful etiological studies with respect to certain well-defined symptoms. So mental disorders commonly, or so far, do not exist per se and are not distinct entities. And commonly, we have the problem of symptom overlap. For example, depressive symptoms are more of the rule than the exceptions, also with mental disorders other than mood disorders. Because there are, in a way, also a normal reaction to not feeling well. So if we look at that, so normally you have like the symptom identified with descriptive psychopathology, and then the diagnostic entities in terms of the clinical or nosological psychopathology take these symptoms, group them, and make additional requirements on the symptoms course, on the symptoms minimum time of persistence, their frequency, their association or the lack of it with certain situations of life events, the symptoms context, and that should actually include cultural and developmental consideration, and that should not just be based on thinking, but also on studies, and on the symptoms non-functionality and or burden. What is missing and what was there in the past with the older psychopathologists like Jaspers or Kreplin or Bleuler, what is not included is the patient's appraisal, the patient's self-appraisal or self-perception of an intra-individual change. So that is already kind of generally taken out of these definitions. I hit this button again. I have to put the mouse somewhere else. So this is what comes in addition in clinical or nosological psychopathology, that is with that, of course, based on descriptive psychology. And today, taking out this self-appraisal of the patient, diagnosis relevant symptoms are frequently also observable epiphenomena, as I said before, like the current diagnostic manuals are only based on a subgroup of symptoms that initially and formally had just been regarded as like the minimum requirement, but not something to get a whole picture of a patient's problems. And as Nancy Andreas, and I don't know whether you have heard of her, but she has been like the main expert in of psychopathology in the US for a long time, a very influential researcher, and already in 2006, in the introduction of DSM-5, or in the wake of the introduction of DSM-5, she complained that classics of psychopathology are now largely ignored, and research in psychopathology is a dying, or if not already dead, enterprise. And she really complained that with that, clinicians are really discouraged nowadays to getting to know the individual patient and to understand the gestalt of her state of mind. And even if often nowadays, if they think they do, they don't have a good apperception of the symptom and they can't fully acknowledge that. And with that, and this is also important, that you don't mix symptoms and syndromes or disorders. Symptoms are always something by themselves that can occur in many syndromes and many disorders. There are very, very, very few symptoms that are, if any, that are just occurring in one disorders. And some of the problems that are around the discussion of whether or not mental disorders should be introduced or whether or not something is a mental disorder or not is actually due to the already blurred or insufficiently apprehended distinction between normal and abnormal on a symptomatic level. And of course, like cultural dimensions, the manuals say, well, it shouldn't be culturally appropriate, but they don't give any guidelines for single symptoms, what might play into a certain symptom and how to kind of appraise a certain experience in light of a certain culture. And they list some culture-bound syndromes, for example, in the Southeast Asia, that's Coro and Lata, that are kind of only occurring within these cultural regions, but they don't really in their description give guidelines on how to actually do the appraisal of the cultural background. And that, of course, is especially in a more global society where you're more and more confronted with people with other cultural backgrounds, that kind of makes symptom assessment and therewith diagnosis more and more invalid and inappropriate. And I think it's no surprise with that, for example, studies from the UK and I think also from the US report that, for example, faulty diagnosis of psychosis are much more given to people with a migrant background that places them to countries that are in which there are more black-skinned people are living, because their cultural background then is not appraised sufficiently, not understood sufficiently, and normal beliefs might then be considered delusional. And how that might, this whole thing about how symptoms or single symptoms do not relate to single syndromes, that I would like to elucidate with briefly with two symptoms that you often would think, well, if they are present, that should be a psychotic disorder, and that is delusion. And I will give you some idea on what is to consider when you have a delusion-like belief. Then first of all, of course, you would have to consider whether this is a manifestation of a subculturally or religiously sanctioned belief system. If it is, then certainly it's not a pathological symptom and not a mental disorder. An example would be, for example, if someone from the Caribbean with a background in voodoo would come and report that they have been put, or that a bad spell has been put on him or her, and that he is now cursed by someone and therefore feeling bad. This is something where within the voodoo religion is believed that can happen. That is not and therewith it's a sanctioned belief if the person, and only then if the person is still well within this cultural background and quite well linked to this cultural background. Then, of course, you would have to see whether or not someone is fully convinced and is not considering alternative explanations. If this can still be done, then you might consider whether unusual, hardly comprehensible thought contents are there since early childhood and associated with severe social interactive problems, especially with regard to social emotional reciprocity. And some of you might guess already what you would then consider. If that would be true, then it might not be some delusion as part of a psychosis, but it might be a part of an idiosyncratic thought content as part of an autism spectrum disorder. Or if that is not the case, but the unusual beliefs is or paranoid thought contents are present still since adolescence, but associated with social interactive problems due to lack of trust in others, then you might rather consider a schizotypal paranoid personality disorder, still not a psychotic disorder. Or if you have grandiose thought contents present since adolescence and associated with a need for admiration and lack of empathy, and I couldn't resist putting this picture there, then you might consider a narcissistic personality disorder rather than a grandiose delusion as part of a psychosis. And if there are in particular paranoid thought contents since adolescence in stressful situations in particular that are associated with an instability of interpersonal relationship and affects, then you might consider a borderline personality disorder. Or if these have newly occurred especially in an adult, or significantly worsened in the past 12 months, you might consider a clinical high risk for psychosis syndrome with attenuated psychotic symptoms, because still you don't have what is needed for psychotic disorders, and that is the full conviction and with no doubts on the thought content. And only if this isn't there anymore, you are confronted actually with a delusion that you then need to place within the certain mental disorder according, and I won't, for time reasons, I don't go into the whole details here, that according to possible substance or medication use might be placed within substance use disorders, or if it's along the line with a medical condition, there might be a physiological consequence of that, might be placed within the context of an organic mental disorder, or when it's present only in the context of an obsessive compulsive disorder and is closely linked to the obsessive compulsive behavior, then you might better score it as severe OCD with absent insight, delusional belief. And I don't know whether or not in your practice, do you use DSM-5 or do you use the ICD-10 clinically?
DSM.
The DSM. Okay,
Yeah.
then this is already in the DSM, because it will be in the ICD-11 as well. Or if it's a delusion in the context of a body dysmorphic disorder, then also it's not a psychosis, but again, a severe body dysmorphic disorder with absent insight. The same is with a hoarding disorder. And then comes all the questions that deal with the context of either a manic or depressive episode. So then you have to consider all the affective psychosis. As I said, for time reasons, I don't go into all the details there. If mood symptoms don't play such a role there, then you start to consider the time period and the placement with other positive psychotic symptoms like hallucination, disorganized speech, grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, or severe negative symptoms. And consider the overall duration, and then you come into the range of schizophrenia spectrum disorders with all their variant subgroups, including schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenic form disorders, and delusional disorders, if it's just the delusion. And yeah, we have the mood disorders, and when it's less than 1 month, but more than a day, but less than a month, you might consider a brief psychotic episode. And when it's none of these, but leads to relevant burden or impairment, you might just have another specified, unspecified schizophrenia spectrum disorder, or if it meets the criteria for brief intermittent psychotic symptoms and is spontaneously remitting, you might also have psychosis risk syndrome, in this case with brief intermittent psychotic symptoms. But if you have gone through all this and it has no relevant burden or impairment, you might even, after all this consideration, come to the conclusion that it's a non-pathological delusion, so no mental disorder. And this, in fact, varies a little bit between DSM and ICD-10, because in the ICD-10, symptoms such as delusions or hallucinations are considered pathological, even if they don't impair functioning or don't cause burden. So in there, it would stop with that, and the last consideration about psychopathology wouldn't come. So, but this is not for you to remember it all, but just to show you how much, even if you have a likely symptom, how important it is to consider how it comes across, what are the specific characteristics of the symptoms, what is the course, what are the other symptoms that are grouped around it. So actually you are questioned to get this Gestalt. Yeah, but you might not be sufficiently trained. So, and for time reasons, the same could be looked at with hallucinations. Of course, you can look at this in your slides. We don't have the time to go through this. And then at the third part, you have the theoretical or etiological psychopathology. And this is actually the study of the etiology of pathogenesis of symptoms and syndromes. And thus, this one strongly links psychopathology to neuroscience. And this is what I said also before. If this is, of course, based on both this descriptive psychopathology, if you study the origin of symptoms, or on descriptive psychopathology, if you study the courses of syndromes. And if you have not been exact and good in both of these former psychopathological skills, then of course you likely have an invalid syndrome, and you will not find a reliable, consistent, likely neurobiological or other cause of it that sufficiently explains the etiology. Because what you look for as a cause of a syndrome, of course, strongly depends that you actually have a valid syndrome. So here, this is all linked together. And it's again that because oftentimes, especially neuroscience, is failing to find valid courses of nowadays mental disorders, that they conclude from that, oh yes, we can't find the courses. So what has been done in terms of defined symptoms and syndromes was poor. But then again, they might actually rely on symptoms that are poorly assessed or syndromes that are poorly defined and poorly assessed. And this might be even worsened because DSM, that is predominantly used in science, is explicitly putting its main focus on reliability, so that interviewer 1 gets the same results as interviewer 2. They have been sacrificing validity, and of course that backfires also on etiological psychopathology. If you don't have valid mental disorders, if these are not really good syndromes, then you won't find a good course for them. And from that, as I said, neuroscience has immensely criticized the syndromes and therewith psychopathology. And this is even more so that in the past, neuroscience had been a method of psychopathology, but now neuroscience and psychopathology research have been separated. The neuroscience have taken a life on its own with little knowledge of psychopathology. So they oftentimes just rely not even on clinical interviews, but on some standardized questionnaires to assess syndromes. So there is the intrinsic link between neuroscience and psychopathology in working together, that has gone lost. And this separation of neuroscience and genetics from the subject of psychiatry, from the mind, that is what Nancy Andreasen has called the dehumanizing impact of DSM on the practice of psychiatry. And that will, again, there is no looking back, but there's a looking forward. And the conclusion is not we need better psychopathology, but oftentimes the conclusion is we have to get rid of psychopathology. And that is the dehumanizing impact. So when we look at the interplay of psychopathology and neuroscience, then what makes it even more difficult is that psychiatry and clinical psychology and psychopathological research, in particular the theoretical psychopathology, has always been positioned on a continuum between natural facts and human constructs. The mind in its whole is like the topic of a lot of philosophers, yeah, but it's also a topic, or the brain is a topic of the neuroscience. But the mind is definitely, I think we all agree on that, the mind is more than simply adding up brain events. And that is something that is not in the perspective so much of the neuroscientists, but that might be more than in the perspective of the philosophers. And clinical psychologists and psychiatrists are somewhere in between. And that, of course, this problem and kind of relating to each other is then again worsened by a lack of a common nomenclature. When I read philosophical things about the mind, I hardly understand their words because they're so far apart from our psychopathological or psychiatric wordings. Yeah, so, and that separates these positions. And while they should work together, that kind of increases and worsened an already poor situation that from that is suffering the patients are most. So what we should actually work on, and I do hope I reach the hearts and the brains of some of your young researchers with that, is that we should look that we kind of reintegrate the mind and the brain again. Yeah, that we do neuroscience with good knowledge of psychopathology, and where neuroscience and psychopathology informs each other likewise. So because neuroscience can also inform us possibly, especially with the good measures today, on better defining links between normal and abnormal. So what we actually need to rescue psychopathology and to rescue that what has actually helped our patients, and to actually what is actually expected from us by our patients, and that is that we understand them well and can adequately place their self-experience in coherent pictures. Pardon me? Then we should integrate what the skills we have. This is psychiatry, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, genetics, epidemiologically, computer science, but also mathematics. But to do that, we would need to come up with a common language, or at least with kind of dictionaries that we can use when we communicate with each other, and that translate our field of research specific language to each other. And so we need actually multidisciplinary projects to validly define what is abnormal and normal in human experience and in brain function together, so that we come up with valid symptoms. We need more valid, reliable, and broadly applicable and sufficiently economic instruments to assess these symptoms. And this is purely, even if just considering that we want to take it into practice, and there the time that we need to assess them should be covered by health insurances. Or we need to make more politics that psychiatric or psychological diagnostic assessments are given more time that is paid. We should see how these abnormalities and normalities relate to each other over time to newly define really valid and reliable nosological constructs. So this is mental disorders that include the whole range of complaints that patients might express, that will allow a more precise and personalized diagnosis and prognosis, and will allow for efficiently benign treatments to be used more adequately or to be developed. And of course, we need to better include the dimension of time. This is the likely course of symptoms, so that we don't misjudge a current mental state, but can distinguish that from an underlying illness. And just to illustrate that, the central role of psychopathology. So if you have this three domains, then of course the descriptive psychopathology greatly informs the clinical and the theoretical psychopathology, and the clinical psychopathology, of course, also the theoretical. So this goes mainly like this, although it can also go the other way around. And then if you have the field of clinical studies with all its tasks that are interrelated, from assessment to treatment, prevention, e-health approaches, relapse prevention. And if you, on the other hand, have the neuroscience with all these subdomains, then you will foremost have the clinical psychopathology informing the assessment and the diagnostic skills, of course, with all the impact that it has on later decisions on treatment. So a very, very crucial thing to do. It will also, especially the descriptive psychopathology, will inform on predictors and early signs to allow prevention. The theoretical psychopathology will provide the targets for the neuroscience, independent of what is resulting from descriptive and clinical psychopathology, while neuroscience in particular might provide methods to kind of go back into theoretical psychopathology that then might inform the other fields. And from that, this interplay of neuroscience and psychopathology might contribute again to define valid symptoms and syndromes, and to inform on predictors and mechanisms of how intervention might happen, and it might inform on mechanisms and possible treatment targets. So as you can see from that, really much depends on psychopathology, and if that is poor, then the rest of the endeavors will likely fail. So, and this is Nancy Andreasen. That was, as I would say, an early voice in the wilderness, but not well heard, who said that and that was in 2006, so 15 years ago, we need to make a serious investment in training a new generation of real experts in science and art of psychopathology. Otherwise, we high-tech scientists may wake up in 10 years. So unfortunately, we have to realize that already, and discovers that we face a silent spring. Applying technology without the companionship of wise clinicians with specific expertise in psychopathology will be a lonely, sterile, and perhaps fruitless enterprise. And I think it's hardly better to be summed up. So we have half an hour left, do we? Rini?
Yeah, bro.
We have half an hour left.
We still have a time.
Okay.
30 minutes more.
So I think maybe one or two brief questions are fine now, if there are any.
Any question, participant? There is no question in the chat, but maybe you want to ask directly to Frauke. Okay, I think we can continue, Frauke.
Okay. So then with that, we come to the mental disorders, rather to the global definitions. And this is from the American Psychiatric Association and from the DSM-5. It says a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by a clinically significant disturbance in individuals' cognition, emotion, regulation, or behavior, and reflects a dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning, usually associated with this significant distress and disability. It shouldn't be rated if it's expectable or culturally approved response, or if it's a social deviant behavior and conflict that is primarily between the individual and society. For example, in our society at the moment, these conspiracy theories related to the COVID-19 pandemic could be regarded as such. So it wouldn't be regarded as a delusion, but it would be related to a conflict between the individual and the society, and not as a mental disorder. When you look at the homepage of the American Psychiatric Association and look what signs and symptoms of mental disorders are listed there to indicate that you might need to consult a specialist, then it's sleep and appetite changes, mood changes, withdrawal, drop in functioning, problems in thinking. This is like concentration, memory, an increased sensitivity, apathy, feeling disconnected, or a sense of unreality. So this taps more into depersonalization, derealization, illogical thinking that might as well cover delusions, nervousness, and unusual behavior, in particularly odd, uncharacteristic, or peculiar behavior. Generally, they think that one or two of these symptoms alone cannot predict a mental illness, but that people should seek help when there are several symptoms or if there are suicidal or aggressive thoughts. And I think with that, already the APA is against their own criteria, because a single delusion that would be in here with illogical thinking, of course, can constitute a delusional disorder and might also require some attention. So maybe it would have been better here that if you have any one or more of these symptoms that cause problems even with others, that would be with a delusional disorder, that probably would more cause problems to others, then you should seek help. So if you think about what we had seen in the Indonesian adolescents and compare that to this list of symptoms, then we see that especially commonly self-perceived symptoms of mental ill health would have been absent in Indonesian adolescents as a sign of mental illness. And that are the mood changes and apathy, the hypersensitivity and nervousness, the cognitive disturbances, and illogical thinking, and some of the unusual behavior, because they had focused more on the physical appearance, and at least in the list, it wasn't present on violence and self-harm. So here you can already also see a clash of cultures, where in the Western culture, where people are probably more individualistic and more concerned with themselves and looking into how they feel. In the Indonesian culture, it might be more the perception of how I do with the group, how I do in the society, so more with observable behaviors and less with the feeling, but more with the functioning of a person that is perceived as a sign of mental illness. So possibly if you would, for example, just take this homepage from the APA and translate it into Bahasa, you would miss several patients that would read through it and would then think, oh no, that is not my problem, or relatives of possible patients that would read through the list and think, oh no, that is not our problem, we don't have to go there. Yeah, that is, for example, one like practical example where it's important to much more consider culture and perceptions in the different society. So then what might causes this disparity? What would you think? Is it differences in the nature of mental health, or is it differences in mental health literacy? I think it might be both, but it might also be failures in the definition of mental health literacy. And this, instead of a full conclusions, to fire up a discussion that we hopefully have some time left, then is that I'd like to take a final critical glimpse on global mental health. And global mental health is actually an emerging field that tries to address the disparities in mental health that was found in populations around the globe. But recent debates have raised questions on the goals, methods, and current approaches, and that are very much based on critiques that emphasize the difficulties and potential dangers of applying Western categories, concepts, and interventions on other cultures. And critics voice that the concern is that in the struggle, in a way, against this disparities in global health and mental health, that we are in danger of simply taking Western concepts and applying them, because that's quicker in doing something, but it might have negative effects. And that starts already with challenges to the core assumptions. For example, the estimates of prevalence and burden of mental health problems in middle and low income countries are generally based on very limited data, whereas there is a wealth of different studies over time with different methods that allow for meta-analysis, so for a good perception of evidence in Western countries, while it's often based on just one or let's say two studies in low and middle income countries. Then oftentimes determinants of mental health outcomes are based on studies done in Western countries. Western countries oftentimes, at least nowadays, are free of war conflict, are sufficiently rich with good employment rate. So all the social stressors or the environmental stressors that play in lower middle income country, like social inequalities, poverty, unemployment, structural violence, war or civil conflicts that might play into mental health, will not be sufficiently recognized as determinants of mental health outcome in these Western countries, because they simply don't play such a role. Then also based on Western countries is the definition of a treatment gap that exclusively sees mental health professionals as the only source of a good treatment and ignores or downplays community-based and traditional approaches that might also help with a variety of mental problems or disorders. For example, with anxiety disorders or certain types of depression, traditional approaches might as well do well. And then the evidence-based practices are generally developed in Western countries with no consideration of cultural appropriateness, feasibility, or effectiveness in other countries. So this is actually, so that the challenge that there is overall a high prevalence and burden, that the mental health outcomes are generally poor, that there's a treatment gap, and that as particularly practices have to be used to treat certain disorders. This is already challenged as something that results from culturally inadequate conclusions. So with that, also from the Western countries, it is that oftentimes neuropsychiatric disorders are assumed to be biologically determinant entities with stable features, course, and outcome, but that these might all be different in other countries. They assume that treatments can be readily applied across cultures. That might not be the case. And as I said, they might falsely emphasize professional mental health interventions when actually traditional interventions might as well be good. And equally, current approaches to mental health literacy might not sufficiently engage with local and folk understandings. So in practice, and in particular in early non-severe states of mental disorders, that might mean that in non-Western cultures, Western explanations of problems might not fit well with the understanding, might actually undermine the interpretative systems that are associated with coping strategies, healing practices, social support, and integration. And I think the earlier comment of one of the participants that said that there might be actually a loss of social support if an adolescent seeks professional help, while the parents think that there should be more obedience to religious rules and praying. That might actually also already point towards such negative effects of rigorously applying Western definitions and actions to other cultures. So my main conclusions for that, and I hope that this might also kind of generate maybe more research projects or more research ideas amongst us, is that an in-depth and culture-sensitive psychopathologically research at all levels, descriptive, clinical, and theoretical, is needed to provide a reliable basis for culturally adapted preventive but interventions and awareness campaigns. And so I hope for the rest of the time we have for a lively discussions, and looking forward to your comments. And that is again one of my poor approaches to Bahasa.
That's very lovely, Frauke. You can say it in Bahasa, Frauke?
Oh, I can try it, but I haven't listened to it. So the other one I had like listened and voice.
Yeah.
But I hope it's nevertheless. I only hope it's halfway okay with the automatic transitions.
The structure is very good, Frauke.
Okay. But I was lucky with the translator.
Okay, we still have
comments, questions.
Time. Yeah, 40 minutes. Is there any question for participant?
I want to ask a question. Maybe just a discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah. And before I ask the question, I want to read this for you. Frauke, terima kasih banyak atas perhatian dan kontribusi Anda dalam diskusi.
It sounds so nice.
Terima kasih.
When you say it.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, with the things related to the global mental health and the critic. Yeah. And for myself, I'm still also, as you said as well in the last session, that's yeah, for example, here in Indonesia, if we not using like the Western approach or the modern quotes and quotes, the modern approach of treatment, for example, Then what we found here mostly are from treatments from traditional healers. Sometimes you say what is with the physical, like physical punishment, or you say pasung, yeah, or you say spiritual things, yes, spiritual approach, yeah, spiritual approach. For example, that people will say, or the healers will say that there are spirits coming into the body, and then they have to take it out. Yeah, you say many things. Yeah, sometimes like ceremonial things, kind of voodoo things. Yeah, the sort of things. Then yeah, it's become because the efficacy is not quite high. We found it, and then coming back into the Western approach, or the modern approach might be better than the traditional ones. Yeah. So, and then it's degrade what we call global mental health goals to achieve in this task, to find out what is actually there in our culture, sort of thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's mixed between we want to find out what are in our culture or in our context, but most of us still doubt with the efficacy of this approach.
But I think that needs. Don't misunderstand me. I don't want to throw out the baby with the bath. Yeah, I wouldn't say, well, never look at Western approaches. Yeah, but look at them critically, and see what you possibly might do better. And I think maybe with the assumed inefficiency of the traditional approaches, there might be a kind of selection bias, because of course what the people that you will see are those that spiritual healers couldn't help. Yeah, they might have tried, but they couldn't help them. You won't see the people with mental problems in whom the treatment of the spiritual healers was effective, because they don't come to you. You understand what I mean? Yeah, and so if someone goes to a spiritual healer, let's say because of anxiety, and it helps, they will never come to you. But if someone goes to a spiritual healer, let's say also for anxiety, but it's a more severe anxiety disorder and the spiritual healer can't help them, then you see them later on. And that might give you the impression that spiritual healers can't help. While maybe the question is more, who can be helped by spiritual healers and who not, and then work together with them, just as with religious leaders and spiritual, to join forces and to quickly guide people the right way, so that you kind of inform yourself and look who can well stay with a traditional healer, or with who's helped with talking to an imam and searching more solace in God. But who are the ones that for whom this is not sufficient, and who might more profit from at least from likely adapted but Western-based interventions. And I think that is the thing that the critics of this global mental health issues mean. Yeah, that this is is the things that need to be better researched.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Yep. Yeah. So yeah, we cannot just generalize, yeah, as one.
Yeah, but
Okay,
because
yep,
then,
thank you.
Then even with those who are skeptic about, let's say, more Western professional mental health provisions, if this is well rooted into their other approaches, and if it's linked, then they will be much more likely to come to you sooner when they need you. Because then they will be guided by those they trust, that they say, oh, this is something that we come to our limits, where we can't help you. Yeah, and please go there. And then they will likely accept that much better.
Yep. Yeah, you're right. Yep. I agree with that.
Yeah, and these kind of thresholds, that is, for example, something, or the context of this. This is something where you can do research in, or as we tried with our common project, yeah, that we do not just take like the Western questionnaires, but that we think about how to address also specific beliefs of Indonesian people, and that we add this to it, and maybe we should have an additional look in it.
Yeah.
So to even do that better. So that are things that are meant by these critics of a global mental health approaches that are so reliant on Western countries.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Yeah, we may need to also think about the methods that we will use. Yeah, because sometimes, like in the modern or Western approach, are covered by what we call it. Very scientific methods. They call it scientific methods. While when we are doing research on the cultural things, yeah, seems like less or will be viewed as less scientifically approach. I think we need also to consider about the approach that we used to consider or to ensure that this approach is also can be trusted.
I think the science, even the cultural impact, can be studied as scientifically as any other. Yeah, you can study that as much as the impact of the socio-ecological environment or of education or of something. Yeah, you just have to assess it, and it's generally not assessed. Yeah, for example, if you think about these different cultural distributions on continuums between like masculinity, femininity, individualism, collectivism, of course, together with your approaches, you could give questionnaires assessing that so that you could see a certain individual in their cultural beliefs scores high, low, or middle on these scales that I use to describe certain cultural aspects. Yeah, because you might not even be able to say, well, this is the Indonesian culture, because there again is different cultures and they inform each other. Yes, so even let's say someone who's living in Bali might have a culture that is more common in Java. Yeah, or someone from a rural surrounding might have a very urban mentality. But this could be checked if you for example give additional assessments on the cultural background, or on general concepts of cultural background, for example. And then you can study is as well scientifically as any other thing.
Yeah, right. Okay. Thank you, Frauke. It's stimulating.
Yeah, also for me.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Burini. Sorry, this is a bit noisy.
Thank you, Bu Endang. Okay, Frauke, I think this is the end of our session today. Thank you. You gave a very explanation for today's lecture, deepen our understanding of psychopathology and how to do the assessment, diagnosis, and global mental health. I think this is very important topic for our student, Frauke, especially for our professional master student. Okay. Maybe that's all, Frauke, for today's session. Thank you all participants for attending today's guest lecture. I hope we always happy and blessing with a good health. Thank you, Bu Endang, for being here.
Welcome. Terima kasih banyak. Terima kasih, Frauke. You have to teach Frauke how to pronounce it.
Okay, Frauke. Goodbye, Frauke. Okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Stay
healthy.
Bye, Frauke. Yes, stay healthy, Frauke. Stay healthy, all students and participants here. See you.
See you.
Next lectures.
See you.